The economic forecast is in. It's not looking great for the American consumer. In July, costs for producers and manufacturers, known as wholesale inflation, rose at the fastest monthly pace since June of 2022, when we were in the pandemic. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Producer Price Index, which measures inflation before it hits consumers, jumped 0.9% from June to July. That's the biggest monthly jump in over 3 years. It's more than 4 times what economists expected. Now, higher prices may be hitting American consumers next. So far, consumer prices have been relatively steady. Now, this is partly due to U.S. importers bearing the brunt of some of these costs, even taking steps to offset the impact by pre-ordering inventory and absorbing some of the tariffs to shield consumers. But unfortunately, that buffer between the tariffs and your wallet may not last. Let's take a step back and break this all down. There are 2 kinds of inflation that we measure on a monthly basis. Retail inflation, which is what you, the consumer, feels, and wholesale inflation. Wholesale inflation is the change in prices that businesses pay for goods. So manufacturers, producers, and business owners tend to feel wholesale inflation first before the goods even get into your hands. Costs go up for them, and then they're forced to make some pretty tough decisions. Do they and can they pass the price hike on to you as the consumer? Do they or can they squeeze their suppliers and manufacturers? In almost all cases, the impact eventually makes it to the checkout line, causing you to pay higher retail prices.
Okay, guys, really quickly, I want you to learn along with me because I want to give a shout out to Jaspreet Singh of the Minority Mindset. He did a video recently that I really enjoyed, and he broke down the different types of taxes that the federal government takes in order to make money, because we know that the government doesn't make money on itself. It makes money by taking in taxes, okay? And so he really broke down the different types of taxes. He put them into 10 buckets. So one of them is income tax, and that's the way the federal government makes most of its money, which we're all very, very familiar with. We go to work, we exchange our time, our labor, our sweat for money. And before we get a check, or before we get paid, or if you own a business after, but the idea is you pay the government a portion of that. That's income tax. That's general. That goes to fix roads. That goes for fixing highways and goes for programs like WIC. It goes to different things like that. Then you have payroll taxes, which is similar but different. Payroll taxes, again, is a tax on our income, but it's not as general, it's more specific, and that mostly goes to Social Security and things like Medicare, Medicaid, stuff like that. Then there's capital gains tax, which is the tax you pay once you sell money you made from an asset. Let's say you buy a stock and that stock increases in value. You bought it for $100, now it's worth $1,000. You sell that stock, you're going to pay taxes on the gain that you earn. That's capital gains tax. You have sales tax. Again, we're all familiar with sales tax. We go out, we buy a hamburger, we buy some fries, we buy a beer. Once we pay, we're not just paying for those fries and that beer, we're also paying sales tax on it. Whatever state you're in, the sales tax is going to vary. Some states don't have sales tax, but of course, they make it up in other ways, which one of those ways is, of course, property tax. Another tax that a lot of us are familiar with, I'm very familiar with, is taxes that you pay on the value of your property, really. Not even when you sell your property. That's sales tax. That's a different tax. You're paying taxes on the value of your property. Where I'm at, they assess property tax every 3 years, and based upon what the market is, if your property went up in value, they're going to increase the amount of money you pay in taxes on your property. Isn't that beautiful? You don't even sell your property. You're living in it. Nothing's changed. If anything, it's depreciating, and you've been paying money to fix it up, but you have to pay taxes on it. Lovely. Then you have something called estate tax, or what some people like to call the death tax. And that is essentially when you're passing money along to your heirs. If you have something you're passing on, say a house is paid off to your children, for example, or other items of value, once that exchanges from you to your heirs, they get taxed on that as well. So that's an estate tax or a death tax. You have state and local taxes, which we all know what those are. Those are specific to individual states. Then there's something called corporate taxes. Those are taxes that corporations pay. Corporate taxes are the corporation pays taxes first. Then after the corporation pays taxes, the owners of that corporation then pay taxes on the income that's distributed to them. So that's where the term double taxation comes into play. And then before we get to tariffs, which this video is about, there's a broad bucket called other taxes, which includes stuff like excise taxes. You can think of things like taxes on tobacco sales, alcohol sales, aviation sales, like when you pay for airline tickets, things like that. And finally, we're getting to what we're talking about in the video, which is tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on essentially businesses. Like they were saying, they're the people that are making the products, the producers or the wholesalers or the businesses, not you and I, who go and buy and pay sales tax. Those are taxes they're paying. So it's a tax that's paid by the person bringing in goods and services from overseas. So if you manufacture cars and you're buying, I don't know, this is just off the top of my head, steel, let's say, from some other country. I don't know if this is even true, or this is even something that actually happens, but sure it is. You bring steel from another country, you bring it to US to manufacture your car, you're gonna pay taxes on that. And so that's another way the federal government collects taxes. So President Trump, what he wants to do is increase tariffs, which is what he's done. And his idea, I believe, I could be wrong. If I am, let me know in the comment section. He wants to lower taxes in other areas and increase tariffs. And fun fact is, before, I don't know if it was the Civil War, I think it was the Civil War, the government didn't collect income tax. So the biggest way the government was paid before income tax was a thing was through tariffs and excise taxes. So I think he's trying to take us back there, but there's just so much going on and it's so much more complex now that I don't even know how we would even begin to get to that point. But anyways, they're saying that what's happening now is that companies are going to be forced to pass along the taxes they're paying in tariffs to you and I, the consumers. And so that brings us to what we're talking about now.
This is a great moment because normally you see these things move in slightly tighter lockstep in wholesale inflation and consumer inflation. We're not seeing that, so it's important. This is a great opportunity to point out. We now have wholesale inflation at a much higher number than we expected, and now the question becomes what happens next? Because most of us don't buy things wholesale, we buy things retail.
Absolutely. So the producer price index is all about what happens to the stuff businesses buy. The consumer price index, the C there, consumer, is the stuff you and I buy. And of course, you and I buy stuff from producers. So think about this as the snake that swallowed the inflationary rat. We're seeing it halfway along the snake, and there's a big bulge in the snake right now. So one question, I guess, is whether the snake can just digest that enormous rat stuck halfway through, or is he going to poop it out the end? I'm getting a bit graphic here, as the sort of consumer price inflation that you and I will see. My guess, for what it's worth, is usually when you swallow too big of a rat, something comes out the other end and consumers end up getting hurt.
So to break that analogy down, he's basically saying that the producers that make the goods and services that we then buy as retail shoppers, they're gonna have to figure out what they're gonna do. Are they gonna absorb that extra cost that they now have because of the tariffs that they're paying, the increased tariffs they're paying to get the goods and services or the raw materials they need to produce the goods and services that we consume? Or are they gonna pass it down, the analogy, the snake passing down its you-know-what to the end, which would be us, the consumers, and we're gonna have to take on that extra cost? And the answer is probably gonna be a little bit of both. They're probably gonna try to save us some money, because as many people like to say, oh, all these greedy businesses and corporations and, you know, they pass all the costs on to consumers. That's true to a point, but at some point in time, there gets to a point where people aren't gonna be able to afford certain things. So then they're gonna start to lose business. So it's tricky. It's not just they're gonna pass all the expense down to their consumers and say, whatever, they'll deal with it, who cares? Because again, they're gonna start to lose money at a certain point. So guys, really quickly, let's take a look at what inflation is. A lot of you might know, but it's always good to define anyways. So inflation is the sustained broad increase in the prices of goods and services within an economy, leading to a general decrease in the purchasing power of money over time. It is not just the price of one item rising, but a widespread trend across a basket of goods and services, such as those tracked by the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And inflation can be caused by increasing demand pull, or rising production cost push, and an increase in the money supply, or a combination of these factors. Okay, so why is defining inflation important? Well, it's important because, as she said in the beginning of the video, she touched on all these different points of why inflation is even happening. So the first one is the demand pull. Demand pull is what this video is really about. It's the rise in production costs, the cost that manufacturers and producers have to pay before we even see the finished product, before we get into that nice new car, before we buy that bag of chips, before we buy the bed frame we're putting together because we moved into a new apartment. For any of these things, it's going to be the cost that these producers need to pay. The cost for lumber. Remember during COVID, the cost of lumber? And that's why home prices partly went up, or the shortage of chips, which is a little bit different, but that's why the cost of used cars were more expensive than new cars. Remember that? So that's the demand pull. And then on the other side, you have cost push, which is the increase in the money supply. Now, show of hands, who can tell me when was the most recent time that we had an extreme event that caused a big cost push that really increased inflation? If you guessed COVID, you guessed correctly, because the government printed a bunch of money. And by printing all that money, they increased the amount of money in the economy to be used, right? And what does that mean? What does that lead to? It leads to an increase in demand for goods and services without increasing supply of those goods and services. It's artificial. So if you ever heard the term more money chasing too few goods, that's exactly what this is. So again, think back in COVID when they sent out all these stimulus checks. What did people do with those checks? A lot of people went out and they bought things they didn't even need. Go figure. That's not a surprise. They went out and they bought Gucci, Louis, Prada, Jordans. They went on vacations. They did all kinds of stuff they didn't need to do with that money. That money was not meant for that reason. It was meant to stimulate the economy, yes, which actually it was, I guess, meant for that reason because it was meant to stimulate the economy. And it did do that, definitely did, but it led to the crazy inflation that we have now. Some people, they put it into the stock market, which is why we have stock market at an all-time high. But at least if you do that, you have at least your money is hopefully keeping up with inflation, as opposed to you blew it off on something that's a depreciating asset, like a car, for example, a nice fancy car you didn't need, or a Louis bag, which we learned is fake anyways.
So talk to us about these numbers. What are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the key takeaways is that tariffs are not disappearing. That was sort of like, it had not really been showing up in the data, and we got a bit of it this week in the consumer prices. Now we look essentially up the pipeline, stuff from the exporter to the wholesaler and the retailer to the shelves where consumers buy them. A little bit of a blip in the consumer we got on Wednesday, and now we're seeing a little bit more pressure or pricing to the wholesalers right now. And the fear now is that it works its way down to the consumer. It doesn't have to be all of it because the producers and the wholesalers might absorb some of it in their profit margins, but it does suggest that there's more on the way. Look, the government raised $27 billion in tariffs in July. It's like something like a $250 or $300 billion annual rate. Somebody's going to pay it, and we'll know tomorrow a little bit more, but so far the indication is that the exporters, the foreign producers, are not paying the bulk of it.
All right, so I think she's about to clarify what I'm going to clarify. He's basically saying that means you're going to pay for it, long story short. So the producers, like I said earlier, they're going to consume some of it. They're going to swallow some of that loss by taking less profit, like you said, or maybe by doing shrinkflation. You know, the bag of chips go from this big with this much air to this big with this much air. So same price, right? They might do something like that. Aside from that, you and I are going to pay for that increased cost that comes from tariffs is what it's looking like. Because they're saying that the they're saying the foreign companies these companies are buying the raw materials from are not absorbing the cost. That being said, I thank you for sticking around the video this far. If you like it, please feel free to give it a like, subscribe, and until next time, make smart financial decisions.